Time to have a look at the markets now. Asian markets were mixed following the losses we saw on Wall Street last night. The S&P 500 losing its 7-day winning streak. When we look at the Hang Seng Index, down 0.4%. Mainland Chinese markets, although they closed a little bit higher. When we look at what's going on in Europe, markets on that particular front were higher, basically moving away from this cautious tone that we're seeing in the global markets. Looking at what's happening with the U.S. Futures market right now, trading slightly in positive territory. But to talk to us about some of the themes playing out right now, we're joined by Chantal Marks from F&B Wealth and Investment. Chantal, thank you so much for your time. What do you make of the trading day so far on the JSE?
Well, it's a pretty decent trading day, to be brutally honest. I mean, we've got Nasdaq and Prosus up despite the fact that Tencent was trading a little bit lower in Hong Kong earlier today. We also have the miners up quite strongly, and SA Inc. generally looking a lot stronger. I think the only kind of red patches on the market at the moment are telecoms, as well as some of the shares that are trading ex-dividend today, including British American Tobacco. But overall, as you mentioned, definitely a lot more risk on than what we saw yesterday.
There's a lot happening. What is the, focal point for local markets right now?
Well, it's so difficult to say, but I think that whatever's driving the largest stocks on the market right now, and that I think is probably a toss-up between US inflation and data related to inflation and employment in that market, and then Chinese regulatory kind of outcomes at the moment. So tech regulation in particular is what is driving the movements in Nasdaq and Prosus, and then commodity prices, I think, is probably the third thing that we should be watching quite carefully. That, of course, has a huge impact on the resources space, and commodity prices generally also, when they are higher, is very positive for the rand, and that influences almost everything else.
You were talking commodities, and the first thing that comes to mind is the OPEC plus deadlock. They haven't set a date about when they're going to have official meetings, but no doubt there's probably something happening behind the scenes. What are some of the scenarios you and the team at F&B are discussing that you foresee playing out if this continues?
So I do think that OPEC is always a little bit on the volatile side, and kind of offers some additional geopolitical risk to the global economic landscape. And I think this time is no different, right? So we do have a few scenarios that can play out. So if there's a continued deadlock and you don't have production cuts, then you will, or production increases, then you will have oil prices continue to push higher. If that is not the case and they actually come together and they decide to increase production, the oil price will move lower. But I think generally there will be downward pressure on the oil price regardless of what OPEC does, because of course you've got these US shale gas producers who have a high incentive of starting to get involved in production with oil prices at current levels. So I think generally our bias is for oil prices to decline, and it doesn't really matter that much what OPEC does, although I do think that they will come to the party and push up production. It's in their best interest as well.
Right. Let's talk MTN for a bit. Over the past few weeks, they've been in the news. Last week, there was a lawsuit saying that, accusing them rather, of aiding a terrorist organization. About a year or two ago, there was a similar accusation regarding having paid off the Taliban in order for them not to destroy their cell phone towers. And now it's MTN Eswatini where they're involved again. To what extent do investors pay attention to this type of news, specifically as it relates to listed companies?
So, I mean, this is quite an interesting one because I think that the risks that you just mentioned and the lawsuits that you've just mentioned and the actions on their behalf is exactly why they usually trade at a discount relative to their developed market peers as well as Vodacom locally, because that risk of from a regulatory standpoint and from a geopolitical risk standpoint is always embedded in MTN share price. So I think that to a certain extent, yes, investors do pay attention because that is what's reflected in that discount. But I think that the kind of the nitty-gritty details, as long as they don't pose an immediate threat to the operations of the company or the cash flow of the company, wouldn't bother investors too much. Although we know what happens when it does start influencing the cash flow of the company. I mean, MTN really struggled to pay down that debt pile following the Nigerian lawsuit or Nigerian fine a few years ago. And if something similar happens, it could be very bad for this company.
Right. Let's talk Steinhoff now. On Monday, the share price fell 16%, and this followed news that they had breached certain sections, of the Companies Act 2 years ago. Right now, I mean, when the financials came out, you'd be hard-pressed to find an analyst who still covers Steinhoff. Do analysts still look at this company, or have they moved on because there's no value left?
No, I don't think anyone really covers the stock anymore, to be 100% honest. But it is up 17% today after being down 16% on Monday. Today's news flow has to do with the fact that some of the South African asset managers have withdrawn a court action against their settlement proposal. So a lot of stuff happening in Steinhoff at the moment. I mean, we're certainly looking at it because our clients are quite interested, and it's still a headline inducing stock. But I think from a serious institutional investment perspective, there are more questions than answers when it comes to Steinhoff. And for that reason, analysts are staying away. From my perspective, I still think the stock is uninvestable. When you do have a situation where companies' debt levels are so high, you don't necessarily, and you can't necessarily see a way out of it through generating cash and paying down that debt and increasing their asset value. It's very, very difficult to see a way through. Certainly the settlement will help because you won't have that legal liability on the balance sheet, but there's still a lot of debt there. So I'd stay away from this one for now, at least.
Any company events or global news that you're going to be paying attention to that you believe will influence the market in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll continue to closely watch global kind of economic news flow, particularly out of the US. Employment in the US, I think, is going to be extremely interesting over the next few weeks. We have their kind of emergency payments or aid payments to households coming to an end soon. And that should give you a better idea of what the employment landscape is going to look like in the US in a post-COVID-19 world. Of course, now I mentioned COVID-19 again, and we'll continue to watch that closely as well. Apparently a Lambda variant is now doing the rounds, while the Delta variant is still wreaking havoc in many economies globally, including ours.
Right, let's talk about ours. How optimistic are you about our vaccination drive? I mean, there's so many of these variants popping up everywhere, posing a risk to economic recovery, whether it's South Africa or different parts of the world.
Yeah, so it does seem as if the vaccines aren't as effective against the variants from a preventative perspective, but that most of these vaccines are still very effective in reducing hospitalization and death. If you can get to a point where hospitalization is reduced drastically, as well as death rates, then you can actually get to a place where you treat this thing like any other normal kind of health event, where you don't have to have a lockdown and you don't have to have economic disruption as a result. In terms of our vaccine rollout, I see that it is picking up slightly. Yesterday's data that we reported on today was very encouraging, a very large increase on a week-on-week basis. And then we've also had 2 days of active case declines, which is very encouraging, but obviously a lot can still happen. And I think that the next few days are going to be very important in terms of monitoring what the risks look like and what the president might say on Sunday when I hope he speaks to us again to give us good news. But I mean, that can actually go either way, really.
Chantal, thank you so much for your time. That is Chantal Marks from FNB Wealth and Investment. News we're keeping an eye on for the rest of the day. We've got Eurozone retail sales. Tomorrow, those FOMC numbers. And on Thursday, U.S. initial jobless claims. That's it from me. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll have more news for you.